So 2008 and 9, right? I remember in October of 2008, I sent out an alert. I do this very rarely to my followers, and I said, just go get cash out of the bank because I was watching some things that were alarming me, right? There's
Yeah.
certain sectors that I keep an eye on. One was reinsurance companies. Another was banks, bank holding and money center banks. I was just watching, and they were just cratering. And of course, people said, "Oh, that was very alarmist of you." And then I read later in the Wall Street Journal, they're describing the CEO of a major bank is walking through his own bank lobby at 2 a.m. in that October, going to this emergency meeting, and the guy recounts how he kind of stopped and took money out of the ATM because he didn't know how this was going to go. Right. So, right.
I can
So
imagine. No,
I
they
knew
were,
it, right? So, but that must have really put the fear of God in that they like how they must have like this whole derivative nightmare almost blew up then is what I'm thinking was what all that panic was about, right? It must have been that there was some daisy chain of collateral
well,
bets
there
that was just
was,
about
and
to
we know,
explosively
all
unwind.
basically many banks were insolvent, and certainly all the prime brokers were insolvent, and they were made banks, like Goldman Sachs.
Yes,
Uh,
right. It's a
they
bank.
were made into banks and
Yeah.
loaded with trillions of dollars to paper it over. So they weren't ready yet for the end game. What did happen was the Lehman bankruptcy was clearly, I believe, teed up, to cement the case law. And I'll just mention this. What happened prior in 2005, there were changes made to what's called safe harbor, which is, I say, sounds good, sounds like a
I
comforting
like
thing.
that.
But again,
Yeah, it's good.
legal certainty, legal certainty, what they mean by safe harbor assures, again, that the secured creditors take the client assets in a bankruptcy, and assures that the derivatives contracts in particular, which are contracts they would have had a very weak standing in a bankruptcy, take
Mm-hmm.
that collateral will go to the secured creditors. And the collateral is the collateral that has been extended out of these pools of client assets. So the Lehman Brothers, in the case of Lehman Brothers, J.P. Morgan was the custodian for client assets. And if you remember, people used to have the idea that the custodian actually had a responsibility to the clients.
Mm-hmm.
So JP
Once upon a
Morgan
time.
is the custodian. JP Morgan was also the secured creditor that took the client assets. So they were wearing both hats. And that's what people have to understand. They're bank holding companies, so they're different subsidiaries. So you have one subsidiary that's acting as custodian, and another subsidiary has security interest in the collateral through the derivatives contracts, where they've used the client's securities for their proprietary trading. And not surprisingly, the very sophisticated clients said, challenge this, tried to get their assets back. And the shocking thing, this is the decision is shown in the book. The Southern District of New York, which is Manhattan, the bankruptcy court there, found in favor of J.P. Morgan, that J.P. Morgan absolutely had the right to take the client assets in the interest of financial stability, and that this was precisely the case that was envisioned
Yeah.
with the Safe Harbor Act, and further that they only had to make a decision as to whether J.P. Morgan was entitled to take the securities. And in the judgment, they say that JP Morgan, as one of the largest banks in the world, is quite obviously a member of the protected class.
Let me bring this up, if I can, David,
Yeah,
because this was just too much for me.
yeah.
uh, so so I'm sorry, what? So you have here. This is I'm pointing. People can't see it. I'm pointing here at this court ruling from the Southern District, and I've highlighted a few parts. But this is they wrote this down. I'm shocked, right? But they said, first up, can you explain what this means when they say, maybe it should be exempt from being upset by a bankruptcy court under the more lenient standards of constructive, fraudulent transfer, or preference liability? Interesting legal words there, but the great
Well,
term.
those, I mean, if you're familiar with bankruptcy, that's pretty clear. And I explained it a little bit earlier that
Yeah,
that this case rang every bell for this having been fraudulent. Now, it's
right.
not hard to understand that what they have done here would have been fraud for centuries, would have been fraud.
Yeah.
And just by changing the law essentially on the eve of the great financial crisis, they allowed something that would have been fraud to be upheld by the bankruptcy court. So what would have made it fraud? It is transferring assets on the eve of the bankruptcy from an entity that is insolvent.
Uh-huh.
Which is clearly the case.
Yep.
That's why it's bankrupt. So
Yeah.
it's grabbing the assets from the entity that is fraudulent or insolvent. But the big thing, now hold on to this, the big thing is that the client assets are taken free of payment. There is no
What?
consideration given for the client
That's
assets.
that's one of the litmus tests for fraudulent transfer.
Yes, yes. So this is how it is legalized theft. I mean, you could explain this to a class of 12-year-olds and they would understand this should not be allowed. You know, that you're using the assets of the public without their knowledge, without restriction, without any oversight, taking the assets free of payment and then saying, oh, I'm sorry you've lost those because we've made it absolutely legally certain that we take those assets.
They said it out loud. They said the quiet part out loud. JP Morgan Corporation is one of the leading financial institutions in the world, quite obviously is a member of the protected class and qualifies as both a financial institution and a financial participant. Normally they don't say that part out loud. But
It is, but the shocking thing is, I mean, it was challenged, the court
Mhm.
upheld it, and broadly, this has just been, let's say, there hasn't been much pushback. In fact, after this, in 2008, this was implemented in Europe. So
Hmm.
Europe harmonized with this um, law. Law was harmonized. So they had gone through a process of identifying countries that had problematic law. Problematic law meaning law that assured that people own their securities. So they had
Mhm.
to support that. And the beginnings of that process was in maybe 2002. So it was running in parallel with what was happening in the U.S., but it was first implemented in the U.S. But it was ultimately cemented into law in Europe under something called the Central Securities Depository Regulation, which was in 2014. So it took years. They worked at this for a long time. And there could have been points where people could have stood up and said, hey, this it should be illegal what you're doing, but the people in government don't work for the public. It's quite clear. They work for the banks that control the governments.
Yeah. Well, so I'm a big fan. I'm this kind of guy. If somebody says they're going to do something, then it happens. I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe they did it, right? And so the WEF came out with this really cryptic little thing when they're talking about the context of the Great Reset. Now, I understand why we need a Great Reset, because when you look at the overall indebtedness compared to the income of the world at this point, there's only one operative question that has to be resolved in my mind, and that is who's going to eat the losses? And obviously, the insiders who have legal access to rewrite the laws are rewriting them busily to say, not us, tag, you're it, right? So I think it's that simple. We shouldn't have ever gotten this far over the indebtedness super cycle, but here we are, right? But one of the things the WF.
Let me say, though, that I believe in looking at this whole structure and how long this has been planned. And, we haven't talked about what's happened to the velocity of money, that this is the big and we'll come back to that as the reason we're in this. But I believe that this hyper financialization, which we began talking about, the moorings being slipped, the growth of everything financial outstripping anything real in the world, has been made to happen. That did not have to happen. And there are lots of examples of things that were engineered to make this excess and the damage a certainty. Again, that if you laid this out simply to a class of 12-year-olds, they would be able to say, well, just don't do that. It's
right.
It's
It's like in 2008 and 9, right? In the context, Timothy Geithner comes out and says, oh, these are too big to fail, which became systemically important banks, or the SIBs, which morphed into sci-fi, systemically important financial institutions. And their answer was, oh, well, let's make a law so that the derivatives get paid off first, so it doesn't destabilize the system. And a 12-year-old who's cognitively there would say, how about you just don't have derivatives?
Yes,
like,
yes.
let's not fix the system to make it safer.
How about you don't
let's get rid of the bombs.
something that can destroy the entire financial system? So you have
an approach.
You have to say, this is part of what I'm trying to do with the book, is to say, look, these are constructs. They're all artificial, and there's nothing inevitable about having created this hyper financialization. There's plenty of evidence that it has been engineered, it has been made to happen. And my point here is that all of derivative instruments aren't even real. That's why they're derivatives. They're a contractual thing describing the behavior of something else, but they have been engineered to take all of the real things.